It was a Saturday in late August, one of those muggy days when the sun seems to be attempting to smother you by pressing through the windows. As I prepared for the relocation Thomas insisted on, I was pulling dusty boxes out of the attic while perspiring through my shirt. He abruptly decided it was time to downsize after living in the same home for 25 years. That's what he said. Not shrink, not alter, not transition. As if I were among the mess. I refrained from arguing. Actually, I never did. It was no longer worthwhile. The scent of aged wood, stale insulation, and neglected Christmas wreaths filled the attic. I was the only one up there. Like any other Saturday, Thomas was in the air-conditioned living room, feet up, sipping a drink of bourbon and watching a true crime documentary. I saw it at that moment, a package hidden amid broken furniture legs and a stack of fading wrapping paper. Unlike the others, it wasn't marked as Hila's baby outfits or winter decor. Thick black ink was used to handwrite this one. My actual spouse. I looked at it for a while. My initial reaction was to chuckle. An ancient joke. A prank package from high school. Perhaps Leah composed it as a child while feigning to have a hidden stepmother. However, the handwriting was too large and methodical. I dropped to my knees. The floorboard creaked under me, and the action cracked my knees. I touched the cardboard lid with my hand. Brittle yellow tape had been used to seal it. I opened it up. The edges were readily torn, as if the box had been just waiting for someone to find it. There weren't many items inside. A fading blue ribbon. A Polaroid of an unfamiliar woman with black hair, sharp cheekbones, a crimson scarf, scent still clinging to the fibers, and laughter into the sun. Additionally, there was a note in a yellowed envelope at the bottom. I took it in my hands and flipped it over. Danielle was the only word written on the back in the same handwriting as the label. Danielle was an unknown name to me. I read the letter. It was a sensitive word. The ink was a little smeared, like it had been wet once. Or just gripped it too firmly. You were always the one, I read. I think about you with her every day. I've had enough of acting. This week, I'm filing the paperwork. I want our lives to start at last. Thomas, I signed this. My hand started to shake. I sat down on the attic floor, surrounded by shadows and insulation dust, and read it again and again. I thought maybe I was misreading it, that I'd misunderstood, that this was something from before me. But it wasn't, because right beneath the letter was a legal envelope. Inside, divorce papers filed in our county, dated October 2nd, 1998, signed by Thomas Rowan. And next to his signature, a blank space. No signature from the wife. But here's the thing. That wife wasn't me. I married Thomas in March of 1999. I just sat there, quiet, numb. The attic was hot, but my skin had gone cold. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones that no heater can fix. My breath came in short gasps. I remember that part clearly, like my lungs had forgotten how to work. I wasn't crying. Not yet. I was in a place beyond crying. 25 years. 25 years of wiping his daughter's nose, waiting up when he worked late, cooking his favorite meals, forgiving every distance, every silence, every cold shoulder. And now I held in my hand proof that my marriage was built on something unfinished, something dishonest, a secret box labeled like a confession, stashed away like I'd never go looking for it. And maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe if we hadn't been moving, I never would have seen it. Maybe Thomas thought the dust would cover his past forever. Maybe that's why he wanted to move in the first place. I didn't scream. I didn't storm downstairs and confront him. I didn't even call my sister June. And she's usually the first person I go to when something feels off. Instead, I sat there on the floor of my attic, my knees tucked to my chest, holding a letter addressed to a woman who wasn't me, and I whispered almost without sound, "Who am I to him?" And that's when it began. Not the pain. No, that had started years ago. Slowly, quietly, like water leaking under a door. What began in that moment was something else entirely. The unraveling. People always say you can't fake a whole life. That no one can keep a lie going for 25 years. They're wrong, because I lived inside one. And I loved it. When I met Thomas, I was 32. I just stopped teaching full-time to take care of my mother, who was battling early-onset dementia. My days were filled with adult diapers, confused phone calls, and tears I never let her see. I didn't have time for dating. I didn't believe I deserved much love. Not then. Then he showed up. He was gentle, polite, the kind of man who listened when you spoke and remembered the little things, like how I took my tea or that I hated loud chewing. That's what caught me. He never tried too hard. He made me feel safe. That kind of thing matters when you spent years trying to hold a family together by yourself. We married a year later. I wore a pale green dress, not white. It was simple. No photographers, just me, Thomas, and a courthouse clerk with lipstick on her teeth. He looked at me like I was the beginning of his life. And I believed I was. When Leia was born, everything slowed down in the most beautiful way. Thomas worked long hours, but I didn't mind. I stayed home with our daughter, turned the spare room into a nursery, filled it with soft books and lullabies. Every choice I made was for our family. There were Sunday mornings when Leia would crawl into bed with us, her curly hair spilling across the pillows. Thomas would reach across the sheets and hold my hand without a word. Those were the mornings that convinced me I had everything. I gave up painting when Leia turned 2. It wasn't a dramatic moment. I just stopped picking up the brush. There were dishes to wash, laundry to fold, spelling tests to help with. I told myself I'd return to it someday when things were less busy. When there was time again, there never was. Still, I loved our life. I loved the way Thomas kissed the top of my head when he came home. I loved how we had our shows, the old detective dramas with British actors and foggy landscapes. I loved how he'd leave a post-it note on the fridge if he had an early meeting, gone to the office. Love you. Don't forget coffee. And I told June once, my sister, that Thomas was steady. She raised an eyebrow. Steady is just another word for distant, Elise. But she lived in Maine. She didn't see what I saw. She didn't live our rhythms. Carol, my neighbor and friend, saw more. She'd ask questions sometimes. How's Thomas doing? You two still go on date nights? I'd smile and deflect. You know us, just the usual. Because there was a usual. And in my mind, that meant everything was fine. I was the mom who made cupcakes from scratch for school events. The wife who always knew where the batteries were. The woman who sent Christmas cards on time and never forgot a birthday. My identity was woven into everyone else's happiness. That was the measure of my worth. And Thomas, he was never cruel. That's important. There were no bruises, no screaming matches, just small silences. Just tired eyes and unanswered questions. Just routines that slowly turned from habits into hiding places. He told me once, maybe 10 years ago, that I was the glue that kept everything together. I smiled proud, but now I think glue holds things that are already broken. I thought our love was the kind that didn't need fireworks. I believed in the quiet kind of loyalty, the kind built over grocery lists, carpool pickups, and shared grief. When his father passed, I sat with him on the porch all night, saying nothing. I thought that was love. I still think it was. And I thought he returned it. He'd never given me a reason to believe otherwise. Until the attic. Until I realized I was never the only story in his life. Maybe not even the first. Maybe not even real. Not to him. But for 25 years, I lived like I was. So when I found that box, the betrayal didn't just come from the papers inside. It came from everything I had believed. The memories, the kisses, the holidays, the quiet pride I carried in my chest when I said my husband. That was the life I thought I had. A beautiful, ordinary life. And that's what made it so hard to see it crumble. The first time I felt the shift, it was subtle, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and sharp. It was my 50th birthday. I had never been someone who made a big deal out of birthdays. I didn't expect parties or balloons. I didn't need a trip to the Bahamas or an elaborate surprise dinner. I've always been simple that way. But I thought at the very least Thomas would remember. He had every year before. Even in our leanest years, he'd find a way to make it sweet. A breakfast tray with burnt toast and orange juice, a hand-drawn card from Leia, a kiss on the forehead that made the rest of the day glow. He wasn't extravagant, but he was consistent. And to me, that meant everything. But that year, nothing. I woke up early like I always did. I padded down to the kitchen, the light just beginning to creep through the curtains. The house was still. No smells from the oven. No footsteps from upstairs. Just silence. I made my own tea, sat at the kitchen table, waiting for him to come down. I told myself he was planning something. That maybe he'd forgotten temporarily and would remember soon. That maybe Leia, then 16 and deep in her teenage shell, had planned something small with him. He came down around 8:30, still in his pajama bottoms, scratching the back of his neck. "Morning," he said, heading straight for the coffee pot. No hug, no card, no acknowledgement. I smiled anyway. "Morning." He didn't notice the extra effort I'd made, curling my hair, putting on lipstick. I even wore the blue sweater he used to say brought out my eyes. He sat across from me at the table, scrolling through emails on his phone. I waited for the light to go on in his eyes. Waited for that moment when the realization would hit and he'd say, "Oh, Elise, happy birthday. I'm so sorry. I meant to surprise you." But it never came. So I asked gently, trying to keep my voice light, "Do you know what today is?" He looked up, blinking like he hadn't even registered my presence until that second. "A Thursday." I laughed, trying too hard to make it okay. "It's my birthday, Thomas." There was a pause, one of those awful stretched-out silences that says more than words ever could. His mouth opened slightly. "Oh, right. I am sorry. I've just been swamped at work. You know how it is. Happy birthday, babe." He leaned over and gave me a half-hearted kiss on the cheek, then went right back to his phone. I smiled. I nodded. I told him it was fine, but inside, something knotted up in my chest. Later that day, Carol stopped by with a tiny cake from the bakery, red velvet with cream cheese frosting. She hugged me and said, "He better be planning something big for tonight." I laughed again. That fake, easy laugh I was starting to perfect. "Oh, you know Thomas? He's not the big gesture type." She tilted her head. "Maybe not, but forgetting his wife's birthday, that's not a gesture at all." I brushed it off, deflected, changed the subject. I told myself he was just busy, stressed, that he'd make it up to me. He always did eventually. That night, we ate Chinese takeout in front of the TV. He didn't even ask what I wanted, just brought home his usual order. I picked at mine, my stomach tight. I didn't cry. I didn't sulk or start a fight. I just felt hollow, like I was there but not really. Like the life we had built was moving forward, but I'd been quietly left behind. And yet I still made excuses. He's tired. He's under pressure. Maybe I didn't remind him enough. Maybe I've been too invisible lately. That's what hurt the most. That I immediately blamed myself for being forgotten. A missed birthday shouldn't break you. But it wasn't the day. It was what it meant. It was the first time I saw him not as the man who held my hand in the dark, but as someone who no longer looked for me at all. It was the first red flag, and I folded it up and put it away in the back of my mind, pretending it wasn't waving right in front of me. It's not like one day you just stop existing in your own marriage. It happens gradually, quietly, like fog slipping in under a door. At first, it was little things. Thomas stopped asking if I wanted coffee in the mornings. He used to leave a cup on the counter, exactly how I liked it. 1 sugar, splash of cream. I never had to ask. Then one day it wasn't there. I made my own. I didn't mention it. I told myself I was being silly. He was rushing. He forgot. It didn't mean anything. But it kept happening. He'd come home from work and barely look at me. I'd be in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew or folding laundry while the news played softly in the background. He'd say, "Hey," without looking up, go straight to his office, shut the door. I started talking to myself. At first out loud, then in my head, I'd hear my voice asking, "Did you have a good day, Elise? What did you do today? Did you laugh? Did anyone see you?" No one did. Not really. Leia had started college by then. The house had gotten quieter, bigger somehow. I tried to fill the space with routines. I'd walk to the post office, water the garden, bake cookies I'd end up freezing because no one was home to eat them. I tried to stay useful, to stay visible, but the silence got heavier. Thomas started traveling more. Client meetings, he'd say conferences. He stopped saying where he was going exactly, just vague cities and late returns. Once I asked if he could delay a trip because Carol had invited us to her anniversary dinner. He didn't even look up from his suitcase. "You can go without me," he said. I didn't go. I stayed home and watched our wedding video instead. It was on a dusty DVD in the back of the TV cabinet. We looked so happy, so young. I was laughing at something he'd whispered to me at the altar. He was looking at me like I was the only woman in the world. I sat on the floor and cried. Quiet, Stupid tears. I didn't even know what I was crying for. The past, the present, the woman in that video who still believed she was being chosen every day. One afternoon, I made chicken pot pie his favorite. I spent hours making the crust from scratch, chopping vegetables, just the way he liked them. It was the kind of meal that used to make him sit down, breathe in, and say, "God, Elise, you spoil me." But that night, he came home late, didn't touch his plate, said he'd already eaten. No apology, just brushed past me on his way to the shower. I scraped the food into the trash, bit my lip, and told myself it wasn't a big deal. But it was. Not because of the pie, but because of what it said. I don't see you. There's a kind of pain that isn't loud. It doesn't hit or scream. It just lives in the spaces where love used to be. Like when your name is only said in passing. Like when your stories are cut short by a phone buzzing. Like when your presence becomes background noise in your own home. And I started forgetting myself. I stopped buying lipstick, stopped curling my hair. I wore the same stretched-out sweaters, stopped looking in the mirror unless I had to. When I did, I hardly recognized the woman looking back. Her face was tired, lips pale, her eyes looked like they were always bracing for impact. June visited once that fall and pulled me aside in the laundry room. "Elise," she said softly, "are you okay?" I smiled and said, "I'm fine." She didn't believe me. I could tell. But she let it go. Because that's what people do when someone insists they're fine. But I wasn't fine. I was lonely. And worse than that, I was fading. Like one of my old paintings left too long in the sun. The colors bleeding away, the outlines blurring, the shape still there, but barely. Thomas didn't notice. And maybe, if I'm being honest, I'd stopped expecting him to. Because when someone stops asking you questions, stops listening, stops choosing you day after day, it's not one big heartbreak. It's 1,000 little ones. 1,000 quiet reminders that you've become furniture in your own life. Useful, present, silent. I didn't know it then, but I was being erased slowly, carefully, and I was letting it happen. The moment that broke something in me happened in a ballroom full of people. But somehow I've never felt more alone. It was a charity gala for Thomas's firm. One of those yearly events where everyone dresses up, pretends to be philanthropic for an evening, and tries not to spill red wine on their expensive shoes. I'd gone every year with him, always dressed modestly, tastefully, always careful to be polite, supportive, smiling in the background. His wife, his plus one. This year, I wore a deep navy dress I hadn't touched in years. Carol had convinced me to buy it back when we went outlet shopping in Charleston. She said it made my shoulders look elegant. That night, I curled my hair, applied lipstick that didn't match anything I owned, and slipped on heels that pinched just a little, the kind you wear when you still want to feel like a woman, not just someone's wife. We arrived at the hotel, and everything looked the same as it always had. Grand chandelier, soft jazz, people clinking glasses and tossing fake laughs into the air. Thomas immediately disappeared into the crowd. I watched the back of his head as he was pulled from handshake to handshake, smiling that smile I hadn't seen at home in years. I stood near the bar, clutching a glass of champagne I didn't want, nodding politely at strangers. Most of the men didn't bother looking at me. Most of the women looked past me. Then someone tapped me on the shoulder. "Excuse me, are you Thomas's assistant?" I turned, blinking. The woman in front of me was in her early 30s, flawless makeup, glittering earrings. Her tone wasn't cruel, just dismissive, like she genuinely couldn't imagine I was anything more than his staff. "I'm his wife," I said softly. Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh," she said, blinking. "I'm sorry. I just assumed." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. She smiled tightly and floated away like she hadn't just carved me open with a single assumption. I stood there, frozen. The laughter, the music, it all faded into a low, dull throb in my ears. I scanned the room, trying to find Thomas. When I did, he was standing with 2 partners and a woman I didn't recognize. She was laughing at something he said, her hand grazing his sleeve, lingering a second too long. I walked toward them, trying not to feel ridiculous. My heels echoed on the marble floor like they were mocking me. When I reached them, he turned to me without warmth. No smile, no greeting. "This is Elise," he said casually. "My wife." The woman blinked. Not warmly, not coldly, just politely. She reached out a hand and said, "Nice to meet you." Like it was a formality, like I wasn't the person who'd built the life Thomas stood on. I waited for him to add something. Anything. A compliment. A joke. A sign that I meant something to him in this room. Nothing came. We stood there awkwardly for a beat too long, and then he turned back to his conversation. I stayed for a moment, then quietly stepped away. I found an empty table near the back and sat down, my fingers running absently over the linen napkin in my lap. I watched him from across the room, laughing easily, animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. And I thought, that's what it looks like when someone has emotionally left you but forgot to pack their things. I didn't cry that night. I didn't storm out or cause a scene. I waited until the end, smiled through goodbyes, took his arm when he offered it. In the car, I didn't speak. Neither did he. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine and said, "You were quiet tonight." I looked at him for a long moment. My voice came out small. "Someone thought I was your assistant." He shrugged. I'm sure they didn't mean anything by it. And just like that, he closed the door on the moment on me. That was the first time I realized something painful and permanent. I was more invisible in public than I was in private. That night, I peeled off my dress and left it on the floor. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The lipstick was smudged. The curls had fallen flat. My eyes looked older than I remembered. And I said aloud to no one, "I don't think he sees me anymore." But maybe the truth was harder. Maybe he hadn't seen me in a long time. Leaving doesn't always happen with packed bags and slammed doors. Sometimes you leave in stages, slowly, silently, until one day you realize you're already gone. For me, it started with the guest room. We had never used it much. It was meant for visitors. The occasional holiday stay from June or Ela's childhood friends during sleepovers. It was small, with soft yellow walls and a twin bed pushed against the window. There was something strangely peaceful about it. Safe, almost forgotten, but safe. One night, after another pointless dinner with Thomas, more silence, more scrolling on his phone, more of me staring at my fork as if it might speak to me, I walked upstairs, turned right instead of left, and opened the door to the guest room. I didn't plan to sleep there. I just couldn't sleep beside him anymore. He hadn't touched me in months. Not in anger, not in affection, not even in passing. The space between us and bed had turned into a canyon. I'd lie awake listening to him breathe, feeling like I was trapped in the wrong life, like I'd accidentally stepped into someone else's story and couldn't find the exit. That night, I sat on the edge of the twin bed and just existed. No tears, no panic, just a quiet kind of defeat. I stared at the framed watercolor of a lighthouse on the wall. I painted it 15 years ago. I barely remember doing it. It looked like someone else's work, someone who used to feel things. Eventually, I lay down. The pillow smelled like linen and dust. The sheets were stiff from disuse, but I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I expected him to say something, to knock on the door, to ask why. He didn't. He made coffee, didn't ask where I was, didn't even glance at the extra pillow in our bed, as if I had simply evaporated in the night, and he was glad for the extra space. I stayed in the guest room the next night and the night after. I started keeping a few things in there, a toothbrush, a pair of slippers, an old robe. I made it mine. The days didn't change. I still cooked. I still ran errands. I still folded his shirts. He still disappeared into work. His phone, his silence. We moved through the house like polite strangers, careful, distant, unwilling to disturb the dust. And everyone thought we were fine. Carol would wave from across the street. Leah would call every other Sunday and ask about school loans and job interviews. June would send me photos of her new dog. Nobody asked if I was happy, because I'd gotten so good at pretending. I think in his own way, Thomas assumed this was easier, cleaner. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't demanded. I hadn't made anything messy. I had just stepped away, quietly. But what he didn't realize was this. Just because a woman stops fighting doesn't mean she's okay with losing. Sometimes it means she's saving her strength for something else. One afternoon, I found a folded pile of his laundry sitting on the kitchen counter. He walked in, glanced at it, then said without thinking, "Thanks, Elise. You're the best roommate a guy could ask for." He laughed. I didn't. The word roommate stuck to me like static. That's what we had become. A pair of ghosts haunting the same house. And the truth is, I didn't leave all at once, not physically, but something in me left that day. Quietly, permanently. A switch flipped, and the light never came back on. I stopped folding his clothes after that, stopped buying his favorite snacks, stopped asking when he'd be home. I stopped being the glue. And maybe the saddest part is he never even asked why. One evening, Carol and I sat on her porch. She poured me a glass of wine and said gently, "You look like someone who's already halfway gone." I looked down at my hands. I don't think he'd notice if I left. She paused. "Would you?" I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure. Maybe that was the scariest part. When you spend so long giving yourself to someone who doesn't see you, the person you were starts to fade. And when you finally walk away, even if no one sees it happen, it still counts. I didn't scream. I didn't slam doors. I just slipped into another room. And in doing so, I began to find the faint outlines of someone I used to be. You always think rock bottom is going to be something dramatic. A scream, a slap, a door slamming behind you. But when I hit mine, there was no sound, just a soft clink of a spoon and a cold cup of tea. It was a Tuesday, nothing special. The sky was the color of wet cement, and the rain had been coming down steadily since morning. I remember the sound of it, a soft, unending patter on the kitchen window. Even the house felt tired, like it was sighing with me. I had just come back from the grocery store. I spent 20 minutes in the tea aisle, because I couldn't remember what kind Thomas liked. Then I remembered he hadn't asked for tea in over a year, so I left without it. The bags were still sitting on the counter when I made myself a cup. Chamomile, no honey. I didn't even want it. It was just something to do. Something that felt vaguely human. I sat down at the kitchen table, my palms wrapped around the mug. And then I stayed there for hours. The tea went cold. The light shifted in the room, moving across the floor like time was trying to escape me. I didn't move. Not out of sadness, not even out of fatigue. I just didn't see the point. I looked around and saw a life I didn't recognize. Cabinets filled with plates no one used. A calendar on the fridge, marked with appointments that meant nothing. A photo of Leia from her high school graduation, smiling between the two of us like she didn't know she'd been the glue for years. Maybe she did. Maybe she just didn't want to admit it either. I stared at the tile floor, noticing for the first time how the grout lines were uneven. Had they always been that way? I thought about the day we moved in. Thomas carried me over the threshold like we were living in a movie. I was laughing. The paint still smelled fresh. We had no furniture yet, just air mattresses and takeout. That night, we ate lo mein from the box and talked about what kind of curtains we'd hang. Now, all these years later, I sat in silence, too hollow to cry. That was the moment I realized I had no idea who I was outside of his house. Outside of being Thomas's wife, Leia's mother, June's sister, Carol's neighbor, Elise alone didn't exist, and that terrified me. I got up, walked to the mirror in the hallway. I looked at myself like I was studying a stranger. My skin had grown dull. My posture had caved in. My lips looked thinner, like they'd forgotten how to smile. I reached up and touched my cheek. "Just to feel something," I whispered. "Who are you?" The silence answered. I walked to the living room and sat on the couch. Thomas had left his jacket thrown over the armrest again. The sight of it, careless, thoughtless, made my throat tighten. I picked it up. It smelled like cologne in the office. I pressed it to my chest and waited for a feeling. Anger, sadness, love, anything. But there was nothing. That was when I knew I wasn't just broken. I was gone. I was a ghost in my own house. The worst part wasn't that Thomas didn't notice. It was that I hadn't noticed. I'd been vanishing for years, cell by cell, smile by smile. That night, I didn't make dinner. I didn't fold the laundry sitting in the dryer. I didn't text Hila back. I crawled into the guest room bed at 7:30, fully dressed, and pulled the blanket over my head like a child hiding from monsters. But there were no monsters in the house, just the quiet ache of being unseen. It wasn't a loud breakdown. It was a surrender. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. And somewhere deep inside me, a single ember remained. Not burning, not glowing, just there waiting. Because even in that moment, with a cold cup of tea, a blank stare, and a vanished self, something refused to die completely. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny, stubborn ember would be what saved me. It started with a spider. I was in the attic, trying to avoid thinking. That's what I did lately. Kept busy. Cleaned drawers no one opened. Organized junk that didn't matter. Avoided myself. Thomas had finally convinced me it was time to start packing things up. We weren't moving immediately, but he was talking about listing the house in the spring. Said we didn't need the space anymore. Said the house was too much for us now. He made it sound logical, neutral, but it felt like being erased. So I agreed. I told myself I'd start in the attic. It seemed safer. Dusty memories, old holiday bins, forgotten furniture. No real emotion left in there, just things. I was reaching behind a stack of boxes to pull down a broken lamp when a fat spider dropped from the ceiling. I yelped and fell backward, my hand smacking into something. A box. Not just any box. This one was tucked deep in the corner, half covered with an old tree skirt. Brown cardboard, sealed with a strip of yellowing tape. Edges warped from time. At first, I thought it was labeled with shipping information, but as I brushed the dust away, I saw it written in thick black permanent marker across the top. My real wife. The word stopped me cold. It didn't feel like a joke. It wasn't a child's handwriting, and it wasn't mine. My first thought was, it has to be some kind of mix-up. Maybe Thomas labeled it years ago for a play or a gag gift. He wasn't sentimental or romantic, but I thought, maybe once. Maybe back then. Still, something inside me tightened. I crouched down slowly and peeled back the tape. The box gave a low creak as it opened, like it hadn't been touched in years. The contents were sparse, intentional, a pale blue ribbon, a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-30s, striking, long dark hair, dimples, laughing into the wind. There was something bold about her, free. I hated how beautiful she was. A folded red scarf. I brought it to my nose out of instinct. Faint perfume lingered, jasmine and citrus, not mine. And at the very bottom, an envelope, thick, heavy. I turned it over. The paper was aged, the corners soft with time. Across the front, in the same bold handwriting, Danielle. I didn't know any Danielle. Hands shaking, I opened it. The letter inside was written in blue ink, slightly smudged in places. The handwriting was familiar. I'd seen it on grocery lists, on birthday cards, on sticky notes left on the fridge. It was Thomas's. You were always the one. Every day with her, I think of you. I'm tired of pretending. I'm filing the papers this week. I want our life to finally begin. There was no date at the top, but the bottom had his name clearly signed. Thomas. Beneath the letter was a legal envelope, sealed but not secured. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside were divorce papers filed through our county court, dated October 2nd, 1998. His signature was at the bottom. The line where the wife's name should have gone read Danielle Rose Avery. The space next to her name, where she should have signed, was blank. I stared at the date. I married Thomas in March of 1999. 4 months later, my heart started pounding, but my body wouldn't move. I sat there on the attic floor, surrounded by insulation dust, silence, and 25 years of suddenly questionable history. I read the letter again. You were always the one. I'm tired of pretending. Filing the papers this week. What did that mean? Had he already started a life with someone else? Had he been planning to leave her or leave me? Was I ever legal, real, chosen? My mind spun through every memory. The wedding, the birth of our daughter, holidays, anniversaries, all now tainted by the shadow of a woman I had never even heard of. Danielle, a name I would never forget. Now, was I a replacement, a backup plan, or worse, a secret he kept from her? I couldn't speak, couldn't even cry. There wasn't room, only questions, only echoes. I felt like I had stepped into someone else's life. And worse, that someone else had once lived mine. How do you rebuild a sense of self when your very identity, as a wife, is no longer solid? I held the letter against my chest and let the attic swallow the silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn it all. I wanted to wake up. But the truth was, I already had. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. Because in that moment, that devastating, gut-wrenching moment, I knew I could never go back to pretending. And for the first time in years, I didn't want to. The attic stayed dark for a long time after I closed the box. I didn't rush down the stairs. I didn't storm into the kitchen or throw the letter in Thomas's face. I didn't even cry. I just sat there, my hands resting on my lap, my heart doing strange, uneven things in my chest, as if unsure whether to collapse or catch fire. I had spent so long waiting for him to see me, to love me the way he once had, or maybe just to notice that I was disappearing. But suddenly, in that silence, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was watching the truth take shape in front of me, piece by painful piece. Watching everything I had once clung to, the marriage, the home, the identity, shift from foundation to fiction. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, something old, faint, familiar. A kind of anger, yes, but it wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, clear. I wasn't angry that he'd lied. I was angry that I had trusted him more than I trusted myself. I was angry at all the times I dismissed my instincts, softened my voice, bit my tongue to keep the peace. All the moments I felt invisible but still showed up. All the nights I curled up in the guest room, whispering, maybe tomorrow he'll notice me again. And I was angry because I'd given everything. My time, my body, my youth. I gave up painting. I gave up working. I gave up pieces of myself slowly, willingly, because I thought that was love. But love isn't supposed to require that much erasure. And sitting on that attic floor with dust in my throat and Danielle's name burning in my chest, I realized I hadn't seen myself clearly in years. I stood up. It wasn't dramatic. My legs were stiff. My back ached, but I stood. I carried the box downstairs and slid it beneath the bed in the guest room. My room. I didn't want him to find it yet. I wasn't ready to hand over that power. Instead, I made tea. A fresh cup, hot this time. I stood by the window while it steeped, watching the sun move through the clouds. I sipped slowly, not because it tasted good, it didn't, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to do something just for me. That night, I opened an old sketchbook. It had been in the closet for over a decade. The pages were yellowed, curling at the edges. My fingers shook a little as I flipped through them. Faces, flowers, doorways, things I had once cared about. Without thinking, I picked up a pencil, drew a line, then another. It wasn't graceful. I was rusty, but it was mine. Each stroke felt like a defiance, like a breath after too much holding, like waking up. Thomas didn't notice, of course. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not when I cooked for myself instead of both of us, or when I stopped refilling his coffee, or when I no longer looked for his approval before making decisions. But something had shifted in me. I no longer cared if he noticed. I noticed, and that was new. I began listening to music again. Not his jazz stations or talk radio, but my old favorites. I pulled out the record player he once said was clunky and outdated and let it spin while I folded laundry or repotted a plant or sketched quietly in the living room. I texted June, asked about her dog. I called Carol and said yes to lunch. I smiled at the cashier at the market and meant it. I wasn't healed. I wasn't strong, but I was aware. And awareness is its own kind of rebellion. Because once you see the truth, really see it, you can't unsee it. Once you remember who you were before the world told you to shrink, it's only a matter of time before you start growing again. I wasn't Elise the wife anymore. Not only. I was Elise, just Elise. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The fire hadn't come roaring back all at once, but I could feel the quiet flame returning. And this time, I wouldn't let anyone smother it. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I didn't say a word about the box hidden under my bed. Instead, I made a plan silently, patiently, because after 25 years of asking for scraps, I was done begging for dignity. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of watching me break. I would not play the betrayed wife with mascara tears and shouted questions. I would be deliberate, unshakable, invisible in the way that power sometimes is. The first step was practical. I found a lawyer. Her name was Mira Cortez. June had recommended her years ago, back when she was going through her own divorce. I never imagined I'd need the name, but now I clutched the card like a lifeline. I scheduled the consultation while Thomas was at work. I told him I was visiting Carol. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Have fun," he muttered. He didn't ask where I was going. He never did. Mira's office was bright and simple. No frills. She didn't pity me, and she didn't patronize me. She just listened. When I told her about the letter, the divorce papers, the date, she didn't gasp. She blinked slowly and said, "Do you have copies?" "Yes," I said. "I made them the night I found it." She nodded. Smart. For the first time in a long time, someone looked at me like I was capable, like I still had choices. Over the next few weeks, I started collecting documents quietly. Birth certificates, our marriage license, tax returns. I photographed everything. I didn't take the originals. That would be too obvious. Just enough to give Mira what she needed to build the case. At home, I moved through each day like I always had, cooking, cleaning, nodding politely at Thomas's small talk. But underneath the surface, I was laying bricks one by one, a wall between the woman he thought I was and the woman I was becoming. I opened a separate bank account under my maiden name, Elise Merritt. The first deposit was modest, $400 from an old savings bond my mother had left me. Then I began putting away small bits of grocery cash, birthday money, anything I could tuck aside without notice. Each time I transferred money, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Freedom. Not the kind people advertise in movies, but the kind that grows quietly under your ribs when you know you're finally thinking ahead. I started walking more. Not aimless wandering, but purposeful steps. I'd go to the library and check out books about reinvention, finance, even watercolor techniques. I filled a little spiral notebook with thoughts, plans, and affirmations I didn't dare say aloud. I said yes to coffee with Carol. We sat on her porch while the wind pushed leaves across the sidewalk. "You seem different," she said one afternoon, sipping from her favorite blue mug. I smiled. Not fully, just enough. "I think I'm remembering who I used to be." Carol looked at me for a long moment. "Do you need help?" "No," I said. "I'm good, really." And I was not fixed, not whole, but steady. I didn't tell her about the lawyer, not yet. I wasn't ready to make it real in other people's mouths. There was power in the secrecy. Even the way I looked at Thomas changed. I no longer sought his gaze for validation. I didn't analyze his moods or try to interpret the silence between us. I saw him for what he was, a man who had told someone else long ago that I was the one he was pretending with. And I refused to play pretend anymore. He noticed something eventually, but he couldn't name it. I saw it in the way his eyes lingered when I walked into a room, the way he hesitated before leaving for work. Once he asked if I was feeling okay. I smiled and said, "Never better." He didn't know what to do with that, because I wasn't cold. I wasn't hostile. I was just unavailable. Emotionally unavailable, energetically unavailable, no longer subscribing to the illusion. Every part of me was preparing, strengthening. I was making room not just to leave, but to become. And I knew when the time came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice because I had already started walking away. And this time I wasn't stopping. At first, Thomas didn't notice anything had changed. He was too used to me being silent, too comfortable with me moving around the house like background music. Pleasant, familiar, never too loud. But the difference now was that my silence carried weight. It wasn't passive. It was intentional. And he could feel it. He'd walk into the kitchen, and I wouldn't look up. I'd keep writing in my notebook, sketching a leaf, making a list. He'd clear his throat and stand there, waiting for the usual acknowledgement. I gave none. Small things started slipping for him. He misplaced his keys twice in 1 week. Left his phone at home one morning and had to turn around halfway to the office. I didn't rush to find them. I didn't remind him like I used to. I let him feel the loss. He began checking in more, coming home a little earlier, hovering in doorways like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I think he could sense the ground beneath us shifting, but he didn't know why. One evening, as I stirred soup at the stove, he leaned against the counter and said, "You've been different lately." I didn't pause. I didn't look at him. "I've been busy," I said. "Doing what?" he asked. His voice edged with confusion, maybe even a little concern. I turned, looked him in the eyes, and said evenly, "Things that matter to me." He blinked. I saw it hit him, not the meaning, but the tone. I hadn't spoken to him like that in years. Not with detachment, not with calm ownership of myself. It rattled him more than if I'd shouted. He stood there for a long moment, then turned and left the room without another word. That was the first time I realized I no longer feared his silence, because mine was stronger now. I took over the guest room completely, not in hiding, openly. I moved in my books, my painting supplies, my slippers, my favorite blanket from before I was married. I made it mine. I began locking the door at night, not to keep him out, but to remind myself it was my space. He didn't ask why. I think he knew he'd lost the right to ask. I started laughing again. Not around him, never around him, but with Carol, with June over the phone, even by myself when I spilled paint on the carpet and realized I no longer cared. I stopped asking for permission to enjoy my own company. I wore earrings again, just studs, nothing flashy, but I saw how he looked at them, confused, like they didn't match the version of me he'd become used to. The version who dressed in neutral colors and didn't speak unless spoken to. That version was gone. He once tried to touch my shoulder in the hallway. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean in. I simply stepped around him and kept walking. That was when the shift became obvious. He'd underestimated me for years. He mistook kindness for weakness. He assumed quiet meant complacency. But now he was standing in the space where my loyalty used to live, and all he could feel was the chill of its absence. He was off balance, and I could tell he didn't know how to fix it. He started trying to be present again, bringing home my favorite bread from the bakery, asking about my day in awkward tones. Once he complimented my hair. I nodded and walked away. Because the truth was, I no longer needed validation from the man who spent years withholding it. And that's the most dangerous thing for someone like him. A woman who no longer needs his attention, his approval, or his apology. He was used to me shrinking, softening, smoothing over the cracks in our life. Now I let the cracks show. I let the silence speak for itself. And the more I pulled away, the more obvious it became that the power had never belonged to him. It had always been mine. I had just forgotten. Now I remembered. And I didn't need a fight to prove it. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't yelling or demanding answers. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is simply stop asking. I didn't plan it for a specific day. There wasn't a grand cinematic moment when I decided, this is it. It just came quietly, naturally, like a season changing. I had spent weeks preparing myself emotionally, building strength, gathering facts, reclaiming pieces of who I was, and eventually the silence between us grew so heavy that speaking the truth felt like breathing again. It was a Sunday morning. He was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, scanning through headlines on his tablet like he always did. Outside, the wind pushed red and gold leaves across the yard. The house felt still, heavy with something unspoken. I came in holding the box. Not the copy, not the folder of documents I'd shared with my lawyer. The original box, the one I found in the attic, the one labeled my real wife. He didn't look up at first. He never did anymore. I set it down in the middle of the table, right between his coffee and his newspaper. He glanced at it, distracted. Then his eyes locked on the words written in black marker, my real wife. He froze, the tablet in his hand lowered an inch. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Still, he said nothing. Finally, I spoke. Calm, steady. No tears, just the truth. I found it in the attic a few weeks ago. He stared at the box like it might explode. I reached inside and took out the letter, the red scarf, the photo, the divorce papers. I laid them on the table in front of him like puzzle pieces. Pieces of a life I never knew he lived. Pieces of a woman I never knew existed. Danielle Rose Avery, I said, tapping the paper gently. Filed October 2nd, 1998, 4 months before our wedding. He opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. I don't want excuses. I'm not here to argue. I just want you to know, that I've seen it, that I'm not in the dark anymore. He looked panicked for a flicker of a second, then covered it like he always did with that polished stillness of his, like this was a business meeting he hadn't prepared for. Elise, listen. I have listened, I interrupted, for 25 years. I listened when you forgot my birthday, when you came home late, when you stopped talking to me in bed, when you let me shrink into someone you didn't even look at anymore. I leaned in slightly, not to be aggressive, but so he couldn't look away. And now I'm speaking. His lips pressed into a line. His hand gripped the coffee mug like he needed the heat to stay grounded. I don't care about the why, I said. Not anymore. Maybe Danielle left you. Maybe you left her. Maybe you never filed the final papers. It doesn't matter. I picked up the letter, the one he wrote to Danielle. You told her you were pretending with me, that every day with me was a lie. I folded it neatly and set it back down. Well, I won't pretend anymore either. He stared at me like he didn't know who I was. And maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd gotten so used to the version of me that swallowed everything whole that he forgot I had teeth. Elise, he finally said, voice low. It was a long time ago. I laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, just softly, like I was hearing how absurd those words truly were. It wasn't yesterday, but it was never gone. His face twisted, like he wanted to apologize, but couldn't find the script. I stood up, took the box in my arms again, held it against my chest like a coffin. Not for a person, but for the marriage I used to believe in. I've already spoken to someone, I said, turning toward the hallway. Someone, his voice sharpened. A lawyer. That word hung in the air like a storm cloud. He sat back, stunned. I think that was when he finally realized this wasn't a bluff. This wasn't one of our old arguments where I'd go quiet and clean the kitchen until the tension passed. This time, I wasn't cleaning anything. I was clearing space. As I walked down the hall, I didn't look back. I didn't want to see his face because this moment wasn't about him. It was about me. About reclaiming my place in a life I had surrendered far too long ago. And I didn't need his reaction. I had already spoken my truth, and that was enough. I thought the confrontation would be the end. But it wasn't. It was just the unlocking of a door I hadn't dared to open before. A door that led straight into the past, one I now knew was built on lies, half-truths, and unfinished business. When I told Mira, my lawyer, about the full contents of the box, and that I still had the original documents, she grew unusually quiet. Then she leaned forward, laced her fingers together, and said, I need to run a few things down at the courthouse. A few days later, she called me back. Elise, she said, her voice calm, but electric underneath. There's something you need to know, something important. I drove to her office. She didn't want to explain it over the phone. She greeted me with a folder in her hand and a look that said, This changes things. She opened the folder and slid the top sheet toward me. It was a certified court document from our county. The original filing, dated October 2nd, 1998. The divorce between Thomas Rowan and Danielle Rose Avery had never been finalized. It wasn't just delayed or dismissed. It was never legally processed. The paperwork had been filed. Thomas had signed, but Danielle hadn't. She never returned her signature. No follow-up occurred. No court approval. No decree of dissolution. Mira looked me dead in the eye and said, Elise, as of today, you may not have been legally married to Thomas at all. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Not from heartbreak this time, from something else. Something almost surreal. I've been with him 25 years, I said. I raised our daughter. I sacrificed everything. She nodded. Emotionally, practically, spiritually, yes, you are married, but legally, that's a very different matter. I didn't know what to say. I sat there in stunned silence, processing what this meant. And then it hit me. This wasn't just betrayal. It was fraud. Thomas had taken vows with me while still technically married to someone else. He'd signed loans, filed taxes, and made legal decisions with me, all under a false premise. I had built an entire life on a lie he buried in a box. Mira sat back and said, We can proceed two ways. Quietly or formally. Either way, you're entitled to restitution, possibly damages, financially, emotionally, even reputationally. I didn't want to fight for the sake of revenge, but I wanted something that mattered. Recognition, accountability, dignity. Over the next few weeks, Mira filed on my behalf. We initiated a formal separation and a civil claim for fraudulent misrepresentation. In simple terms, he presented himself as my legal spouse when he wasn't. He tried to fight it at first. His lawyer called Mira, then called again. Then he mailed me directly with a tone somewhere between pleading and panicked. Thomas came home one night, clearly shaken. He stood in the kitchen like a man who had misplaced his whole life. I never meant for it to be like this, he said. I didn't respond. I just looked at him. Really looked. A man who had once seemed so steady, so composed, now crumbling under the pressure of being truly seen. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply said, I deserve better, and now I'm claiming it. Eventually, he signed. The settlement awarded me the house, full rights to my pension, backdated spousal benefits, and a formal statement of accountability included in court documents. He also had to write a legal letter, not an apology, not for emotion, but an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that would be filed in the county record. It was the closest thing to justice I'd ever known. Not loud, not dramatic, not with fireworks, just the truth, printed, recorded in mine. After all those years of silence, I now had a paper trail of who he was and who I had always been. Not just a placeholder, not just someone's second chance, but a woman who gave her all and walked away stronger than she started. It had been 6 months since the papers were signed. 6 months since the legal letter of wrongdoing was filed, the house became fully mine, and Thomas quietly moved into a 2-bedroom condo on the edge of town. No goodbye party, no big announcement, just a moving truck on a gray Thursday morning and a man who once controlled every room now reduced to boxes. The house was quieter now, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like mine. I painted the living room a soft sage green. I put fresh flowers on the windowsill each week. I hung one of my new watercolors above the mantel, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself what I was capable of creating. I filled the guest room with books and candles and called it my studio, my space. And then one Saturday morning, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Carol usually called before coming over. June was out of state. I was still in my robe, sipping coffee in the kitchen. I opened the door, and there she was, Leah. My daughter, our daughter, 24 now, working 2 part-time jobs and running a tiny apartment across town. She looked different, a little older. Her hair was longer. She wore a tired look around her eyes, like she'd seen more of the world than she'd ever admit. We hadn't talked much since the separation. She hadn't taken sides, not openly, but she'd also stayed quiet. A few polite check-ins, a birthday card, a single awkward phone call that ended too quickly. Now, here she was, standing on my porch, holding a travel mug and a paper bag from the cafe down the street. "Hi, Mom," she said. I blinked at her for a second, then stepped aside. "Come in." She sat at the table where Thomas used to read the paper every morning. She pulled out a muffin and placed it between us. "I got your favorite, cinnamon apple." I smiled faintly, unsure what to say. I wanted to see you," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "I've been thinking about everything." I sat down. "Okay." She hesitated, then said, "I didn't know about Dad, about the divorce not being legal, about that woman, Danielle." Her voice broke slightly. "I had no idea." I nodded. "I know you didn't." She looked down. "I should have asked. I should have come sooner. I guess I just didn't know how. There was a time when I would have tried to fill the silence, soothed her, told her it was okay, even when I was shattered. But now, I just let the silence breathe between us. After a moment, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She slid it across the table. Inside was a photograph of the 2 of us from years ago. Me and her in the garden, dirt on our hands, sun in our faces. I was laughing. She was reaching for my cheek. "I found it in an old album," she said. "I realized I missed that version of you. The one who laughed with her whole face." I stared at the photo for a long time. Not because it made me sad, but because it didn't. It made me proud. That version of me hadn't died. She'd just gone quiet for a while. "I'm getting her back," I said softly, returning the photo to the envelope. Leah reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm not here because I need something, Mom. I wanted to see you, the real you." I looked into her eyes, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I needed her approval. I didn't need to be the perfect mother or have the perfect answers. I just needed to be present, and I was. "I'm glad you're here," I said. "We didn't talk about Thomas much." She asked once how he was, and I said, "You'd have to ask him." She nodded, didn't press, because she could see it, too. I wasn't carrying him anymore. I wasn't defining myself by his choices or his mistakes, and she wasn't here to pull me back into the past. She was here to sit beside me in the present, as 2 women learning to find each other again. When she left, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. Not out of guilt, not out of pity, but because she saw me now, Not as her father's wife, not as the woman who stayed too long, but as Elise, whole, awake, and finally free. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a storm. Not emptiness, but stillness. A sacred kind, a breath held in the earth. That's what my house feels like now. Not lonely, not sad, just honest. I wake earlier these days, not because I have to, but because I want to. There's something peaceful about the morning light. The way it stretches across the floor of my studio like it's greeting me, like it's mine. The guest room has become something else entirely now. I no longer call it the guest room. I don't need to. It's my room. The space where I paint, write, drink my tea without interruption. It smells like lavender and citrus. My robe hangs on the door. My books are stacked by the window. There's a candle on the desk that I light every afternoon, just for the ritual of it. For so long, I filled rooms for other people. I shaped myself to fit their needs, their moods, their silences. I measured my value in usefulness, how much I could give, how small I could make myself. But now I let myself take up space. I leave the radio on while I cook. I dance in the kitchen when no one's looking. I wear perfume again, not because I want to be noticed, but because I love how it makes me feel like art. And every once in a while, I pause and just exist. I sit in the stillness of my life and marvel at how light it feels without all the weight I used to carry. I think back often to that box in the attic, the one labeled my real wife. It's still there. I haven't burned it. I haven't thrown it out. I don't keep it out of sentiment or masochism. I keep it because it's part of a story. Part of my story. That box broke me open, yes. But it also handed me a mirror. It asked me in its cruel and clumsy way, "Who are you without him?" And the answer, it turns out, is more. More than a wife, more than a role, more than the silence I tolerated. Sometimes I still hear his voice in my head, the casual way he'd dismiss me, the way he'd say, "Don't start," when I needed to speak, the way he laughed at a party while someone mistook me for his assistant. But his voice no longer echoes inside me. It fades now, replaced by my own. A voice that says, "You were never the problem. You were never too much. You were just with someone who didn't care to see how strong you were." Now I see it. How many women are conditioned to remain, to forgive, to shrink till they lose themselves. However, I can also see when everything may change. Everything changes the instant a woman says, "Enough," and means it. I see it in my daughter's eyes when she comes to visit, in the mirror, and in the work I create that no longer seeks approval to be daring. The court documents, the compensation, or the acknowledgement were never the ultimate justice. It was this, the ensuing tranquility. The way I now hum when I go barefoot around my own home. The manner that I occupy the table. The way I take deep breaths without needing to prepare. I have no intention of changing the past. I don't have to. It took place. It was important. However, so does what followed. Just last week, I stood in the attic doorway one evening as everything came crashing down. The box remained hidden in the corner under a plastic bucket containing old school projects and a faded Christmas wreath. I kept my hands off of it. I only glanced at it. I shut the door after that. In addition to the fact that it no longer owns me. As the sky became gold with sunset, I went downstairs, prepared tea, put on my robe and sat by the window. There was only calm, no dramatic music or fireworks. The quiet kind, the type you stand up for, the kind you cultivate one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one step at a time. I met the woman I was always intended to be, and she isn't leaving, even if I didn't receive the marriage I had hoped for.